I'll start. Thank you all for coming and for joining. Today is a day where we're going to be focusing on a few different things as part of this, our World Heritage Symposium on Climate Change. We looked at, on the first day, some linkages between climate and biodiversity and how places with ecosystem integrity are vital as a response to climate change. We talked a little bit about potential advocacy responses and how to address the challenge of a World Heritage Committee that is increasingly disregarding the technical advice it's receiving from civil society and the advisory bodies, and what we could do together to try to rectify that unfortunate situation. And we talked about that yesterday. Today, the focus is more on the impacts of climate change on sites around the world, though we are also talking about the potential response, both from a policy standpoint, which we'll ask Eve and Jessica from Earth Justice to address, but also from a strategic standpoint within the convention, how the convention itself could drive large land and seascape conservation to help in the response to climate change. And we noted on the first day, and I'll just say it again, there's a lot of emphasis on climate being something that impacts World Heritage sites, and that's absolutely the case. And we'll hear about that today, both in the context of coral reefs, wetlands, and forests. But the flip side of the coin is equally important, which is that large landscape conservation and seascape conservation of places with high ecosystem integrity is one of the best things we can do to respond to climate change, in addition to ending fossil fuel emissions, because it's something that can be done relatively easily, quickly, cheaply, and provides very quick benefits. So without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to Yves Lador, who is based in Geneva and with Earth Justice. Yves is, well, just to provide some background on Earth Justice, it's a US-based environmental law NGO which uses the law and partnerships to protect people's health, preserve magnificent places and wildlife, advance clean energy, and combat climate change. Yves has been the permanent representative of Earth Justice to the United Nations in Geneva since 1988, focusing on links between human rights and the environment. He's published numerous articles on human rights and the environment, and the work of the different agencies of the United Nations in Geneva and on human rights training. Yves made an intervention at this very last World Heritage Committee meeting and has been is going to present, I think, a very important point, which is how we could strengthen the climate change policy that has emerged from the World Heritage Committee over the last few years and was presented just this last year. How could we strengthen it? What are the ways we could make it more effective going forward? So Yves, over to you. I think you should be able to share your screen at this point.
Yes, thank you very much for Severity, for this introduction and for this invitation. Let me share the screen. I hope we can all have it. So yes, as you said, with Earth Justice, we've been participating to the last sessions of the World Heritage Committee, trying to save a number of sites and work with partners who are working for these sites in the field. You will hear more details, so I won't go at all in any details of that, but we do have an experience with the Great Barrier Reef with our friends, and Imogen will be talking about that, and we'll hear also more from other interventions. We also are working in Bangladesh with other friends from the say the Sundarbans committee, and also with the people trying to save the old Lamu town. Now, as we will hear quite a lot from them directly, I'm just here showing just a few images so that we have in mind when we're trying to have to see the big picture, the scale of the impacts that climate change has on a World Heritage Site. And of course, when we talk about the Great Barrier Reef, we have all the impact of bleaching. When we talk about the Sundarbans, which is the biggest, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, mangrove area in one piece that we have here on our planet, and which of course plays a very important role for the Bangladesh landscape and the Bengal Gulf. And we see these sites, and this is an image which is unfortunately too familiar to some of the sites that we are working on. All of these elements and all the challenges are directly linked to a number of energy policies. And it's very important to make this link with the energy policies, because it does not always come into mind immediately when we talk about conservation as such, and because we're trying precisely to preserve these elements. But it's extremely important. And in some of the discussions that we had in the preparation of some of the World Committee sessions, and Sajid has probably a very good memory of some of the discussions we had in Paris in the preparation of a year ago, the World Committee session, to try to convince the different parties about the link between their energy policy and the preservation of World Heritage Sites. And still today, it is a huge challenge to be able to make these connections. So why are we doing these connections like that? It's because the global warming and the climate change, which is produced by the global warming, well, the global warming itself has an impact on a number of sites. Of course, not all of the World Heritage Sites, including cultural properties, are affected directly by the global warming in the same way. And of course, the Great Barrier Reef and all of the coral reefs are particularly at risk directly because of that. But of course, this is one of the very first aspects, which makes the link between the global warming, the preservation of natural heritage sites, and energy policies. Because the higher we let the global temperature go, the less it is possible to save natural sites. And also it has an impact on cultural sites. Just thinking, if we see the old Lamu town, for example, it is just next to the sea. Sea level rise will immediately have an effect on these events, on these elements. But then you also, of course, have the impact of the energy facilities, which are unfortunately located too easily near World Heritage Site. We have this experience in the sites that I've just mentioned, but when we listen to all of the different sites which are in discussion at the World Heritage Committee, we see that unfortunately a number of sites are directly affected by these facilities. So you have the emissions which can come directly from these different facilities, if they are, for example, coal plants. But then you have all the impact of the infrastructure, and this does also include some clean energy facilities, depending how they are developed, where they are developed. If you don't have a global landscape or a global ecosystem approach, then even clean energy can have an impact. And of course, the operations themselves. And then, as it was said just before by you, Cyril, you have the loss of resilience, loss of capacities. And for example, if the buffer zones of different sites are not correctly protected, then you will be losing these sites. And of course, these sites, for example, if we think about the mangroves in Bangladesh, then they play a very important role in the protection of the people who are living there against some of the hard weather events, and which are unfortunately increasing. So, of course, the discussion we had at the last session of the committee about the updating of the 2007 document, the policy document on the impact of climate change on the properties, was extremely important. And it was good that things were at least put on the table very clearly right from the start, with this paragraph, which was the starting paragraph of this, the updating document, and saying that climate change has become one of the most significant threats to World Heritage properties. So at least things were set in a way very clearly, and that was very good. And it's of course coming from a whole process of developing this discussion, and with a number of consultations in December 2019 and January 2020, there was an important consultation in order to collect information from the different sites and from different areas. But unfortunately, afterwards, the drafting of the text itself was not opened to the similar type of consultation. And this has definitely been a limitation in the drafting process, at least in our view. And we have regretted that, because we think it's important to have a wider and more open policy discussion and scientific discussion, and to have a wider involvement. But this document has developed a number of principles that we fully support, asking for to have a precautionary approach on these issues, to anticipate, avoid, and minimize the possible harm on the OUV, the outstanding universal value of the sites, to use the best available knowledge. And what is interesting is that in saying that, it does include the knowledge of the local people, of traditional knowledge. It's not only the scientific knowledge which is needed in order to have this preservation. And then to have a strong link with the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's true that in a number of situations, and it really relates to what I was saying about the energy policies, the conservation policies are, and especially also for the World Heritage sites, are in a way in a silo. They're kept aside from the general other policies. So it's very important, if we are taking sustainable development seriously, to have and to make these different links. And you have a number of goals which are supposed to structure the activities that the parties have to do now, once this policy document will be updated, in order to implement that, to assess the risks that climate change is doing on the different sites. And I've just mentioned some of them. To include the adaptation that you need for the sites, because now we know that there are some damages which are going to increase in the coming years, so there is a need for adaptation. But of course, you need, to align the climate mitigation policies for the preservation of the sites, and of course to share knowledge among the different parties. So these are all very good elements. But still, we think that the formulation of this policy is sometimes a bit too soft, and it should be very clearly said that one of the elements, because we see, for example, that here mitigation is coming as a secondary element. And again, we have this issue that the linkages with the energy policies that we are developing right now, and which have these so negative consequences on the climate, is perhaps not that enough, is not highlighted enough in the policy document, which still needs to be adopted at the General Assembly in November. And we think that if ever we take seriously the preservation of the outstanding universal value, adaptation is not enough. I mean, we definitely have to have this focus on the fact that emissions and the targets that countries are setting for themselves in the framework of the UNFCCC must be aligned for the preservation of these different sites. And it's not only the site that you have in your own country, it's also, because it is an obligation under Article 6.3 of the Convention, that you must also protect the sites which are under the custody of other parties. And no one, of course, should have a policy that will damage the other sites which are protected by the Convention. So, of course, in this more global policy, which should be set up in a much stronger way, we must, of course, have in mind the common but differentiated responsibilities of states parties in how they, in their involvement in the harms which are going to affect these different World Heritage sites. So it's very important that there is a view of the fair share. And it's only with this type of collective action that we will be able to reach some goals. So as long as we see some states very clearly trying to play a lonesome policy, hoping that the others will do more than themselves, we are just making the situation absolutely terrible. And we saw in the discussions, and I'm sure Imogen will come back on that, we saw in the discussion around Australia how this was played in the last session of the committee, and in our view, very badly played with, because it was not recognizing well enough what was required by the advisory bodies, which was to put the Great Barrier Reef and to list it as a site in danger. And actually, we can say this for most of the coral reef sites which are under the convention. A general survey that was done a few years ago by the center highlighted how much all of them, when you had this very, very severe episode of bleaching throughout the planet for the coral reef sites, we saw that all of them have been affected one way or another. And if we continue to have, and that's really where we're going, unfortunately, to have repeated bleaching events, we are just going to lose these sites. So the challenge is absolutely huge. And it is very important that at the next General Assembly, there is a clear policy which is designed, which really takes this thing very seriously. We still have this impression that a number of states, if not all of them, are trying to say, look, I'm trying to do my best, and just for that, this is enough to be praised for. And this is really something we have heard again and again in many countries. Look what I'm doing. This is just great. But that is not a way to evaluate the policies if we want to preserve these sites. We have to make sure that they are effectively protected by the policies and the energy policies that we are developing in our own countries and with others, because a lot of these energy policies are not just developed alone, they also imply neighbors or other partner countries. So we have to see what is really the impact. That's why this discussion about the impact on the site is so important, because this is the level for the measurement of the policy that will have to be developed. So it's something that has to be discussed in November in Paris with the General Assembly, but it's exactly the same effort that has to be done within the UNFCCC. And that's where definitely both policies should be more connected in the international dialogues, but also at the national level. The National Heritage Site should be one of the elements for the way we develop our national energy policies. So this is what we've been asking in the last session of the committee, and we hope that, and we will continue to ask this in the coming meetings of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves, very much. I volunteered to do the introductions, but I should note that Imogen is really the person who pulled all this together and made this happen. So, Imogen, I'm happy to continue to do introductions, but I'm also very happy to pass it over to you if you want to take over or say a few
Cyril,
words.
I'm very happy for you to. I'm very happy for you to keep chairing as you've done the last 2 days, because it's been excellent. I just wanted to thank Yves for his fantastic presentation and the work that Earth Justice has done with Jess and Noni. It's been really fantastic, and has over the last few years really pushed the whole climate mitigation agenda very firmly onto the agenda of UNESCO and the advisory bodies, actually. So I just wanted to thank them for all the work they've done.
Okay, great. Imogen, we're co-chairing. If you ever want to jump in, jump in. I just to say, for Yves' presentation, I think you know, there's a really vital point here, which is that these different UN conventions have really operated independently of each other in ways that are counterproductive and illogical. And it is important to get these conventions working together more effectively. There is some hope that this is starting to happen in the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're seeing language to the effect that whatever gets decided there is really intended to apply to all the biodiversity conventions, which is a good thing. But it still doesn't answer the fundamental problem, which is that the biodiversity agenda and the climate change agenda needs to be pulled together much, much more closely. And that still doesn't seem to be happening as it should. Conscious of time, unless there are questions for Eve, please raise your hand. But if not, I'll introduce, I think we're going to Sajed at this point. Is that correct, Imogen?
No, we're actually going to Ove.
Oh, we're going to Ove. Okay, all right. So
Yes.
Eve provided a nice introduction of the sites that we're going to be looking at. So the first site in that list is the Great Barrier Reef, which was a discussion that was had at the committee this year, but it's really a discussion that's been ongoing since I think 2012. So it's been going on for almost a decade, since my first World Heritage Committee back in Cambodia. So it's a long-running story. It's a vitally important story, and there's no better person than to tell it than Professor Ove Huff Goldberg, Professor of Marine Studies at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. He's the founding director of the Global Change Institute and deputy director of the Center for Excellence in Coral Reef Studies, and affiliated professor in tropical marine biology at the University of Copenhagen. O's research focuses on the impacts of global change on marine ecosystems, particularly coral reefs, and is one of the world's most cited authors on climate change. He's published over 500 journal articles, has been a dedicated communicator of the threat posed by ocean warming and acidification to marine ecosystems, one of the first scientists to identify the serious threat posed by climate change for coral reefs in a landmark paper published in 1999, and was the coordinating lead author for the Oceans chapter of the Ipcc's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Fifth Assessment Report, and the coordinating lead author on the Impacts chapter of the Ipcc Special Report on 1.5 degrees, and I think a reviewer in the current sixth assessment report on the second working group of that sixth assessment. So Ove is, in short, one of the most distinguished scientists in the world and marine biologists in the world. We're honored to have him with us, and he's going to talk to us about climate impacts on the Great Barrier Reef. Thank you very much, Ove, and over to you. And I think you're still on mute.
I was just saying, can I now share my screen?
You should be able to, yes.
I'll pick the right one. What are you seeing there? Is that coming up?
Not quite yet.
What about that one?
Sometimes it takes a second.
I'll share, shall I?
Yeah, go ahead and share if you're ready. There you go. It's working now.
Yeah, great.
Great. Well, firstly, thank you very much for that introduction. I think, I guess it just proves I've been around bugging people for a long time. As you mentioned, Cyril, that the Great Barrier Reef has really been sort of in the forefront and sometimes called the sort of poster child of sort of the impacts of climate change on ecological systems. And so I'm going to just sort of talk a bit through some of the evidence that still stands as far as this. I know that Scott Herron's going to come up later in the session, and I'm actually sharing this session with Imogen. So hopefully I'll leave you some room given your talk. Just as Eve did to justify one's existence, just to remind ourselves about why we are concerned about systems such as the Great Barrier Reef. This is just a picture of the Great Barrier Reef from a satellite. It's basically 2,300 kilometers long. It's got an incredible biodiversity when you open it up, much of which is unknown to science. So we've recently been exploring the mesophotic zone on the reef and discovering entire ecosystems and species that haven't been named by science. So it really is a sort of an amazing place. And of course, in Australia, it's responsible for underpinning industries like ecotourism and providing between about $5 to $6 billion per year. And this is extraordinary, and it's, you know, this golden egg that's laid by this living organism is quite substantial. And you'd think, of course, given the value of this to first Australians, to tourism, to all the things that it does, you'd think it'd be well protected, and that if you were asked the question, is the Great Barrier Reef in trouble, the answer would be no. Well, unfortunately, that is not the case. And of course, what we are facing at the moment is extirpation of coral reef around the world for a whole range of different reasons. Now, if you take the literature and you ask how are corals doing, you find that in most parts of the world, we've lost about 50% since the 1980s. And the key drivers of this are things like local pressure from pollution, water quality. There's a very big issue at the moment with World Heritage and the response of governments in terms of the health of the Great Barrier Reef, overfishing, the physical destruction, and so on. But more recently, if that wasn't bad enough, we now have ocean warming, acidification, and the intensification of storm systems that are also driving the system towards a non-coral state. Now, I should point out that when you go to a non-coral state, all that biodiversity, well, not all of it, but the majority of it starts to suffer and disappear. And so a reef that doesn't have corals on it anymore may be 100 times less biodiverse as systems that have the sort of rich corals that we've become used to on the Great Barrier Reef. And the number one sort of villain in this, I guess, is rising sea temperatures. And temperatures have been absorbing, oceans have been absorbing enormous amounts of heat generated by the enhanced greenhouse effect. That is changing the temperature of water around the Great Barrier Reef. And over the last sort of 50 years or so, we've seen at least a degree change in water temperature. And it's this temperature which, when you look at its effect on the fundamental ecosystem engineers, the corals, which are normally brown in color, as you see there, lose these vital symbionts that then cause essentially the starvation or disease of corals. And so if you look at some of the early work we did on the relationship between thermal anomalies and bleaching, it was very clear that there were set points for corals, depending on the part of the ocean they were in, that would trigger essentially mass coral bleaching. And so this is a record from Tahiti, where you've got the sort of winter, summer variability. But when you get above this line here, you can be rest assured that these corals will go from the brown color to the white color and then eventually die. Now, when you then ask the question, what's going to happen in the future, and you take that thermal threshold and put it over modeling data, you get this circumstance where these are 3 regions of the Great Barrier Reef modeled from 1860 to 2100 for a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're all getting quite used to in terms of the futures that we're willing to accept or not accept. But basically what you're seeing here is that in all regions of the Great Barrier Reef, somewhere from the early to mid part of current century, you'll cross that thermal threshold and have catastrophic events that lead to the demise of the system. And once you've lost the ecosystem engineers again, you lose the biodiversity, the fisheries, the reason for tourism, and all of that. So it's pretty serious from a socioeconomic point of view as well. Of course, these marine heat waves that are driving this change are affecting a whole series of other organisms. And this is data that was in Nature Climate Change by Small et al. In 2019, where you're looking at the sort of the length of marine heat waves over time. And you can see that ever-present sort of hockey stick that we have come to know And in this case, you're getting a sort of ratcheting up, a frightening ratcheting up of the length of these marine heat waves, and as well as that, you're getting sort of an intensity effect as well. Of course, when one talks about this to people outside outside the sort of immediate sort of coral reef biology world, they find it quite hard to believe that this could be happening and so on. And so essentially what this is showing is the severity of mass coral bleaching events over the last 5 years. And what you're seeing here are record events that come very close one after the other. Whereas prior to 1980, we have no evidence of these mass events, and that through the 90s and into the millennia, we've seen an increasing number of these broad scale bleaching events. And so what you're looking at here, and this was really captured in the media, there was a lot of talk about this, is that when you look at the red dots, you're talking about severe bleaching that's likely to lead to significant mortality, if not total mortality. And that each year in 2016, then 2017 and 2020, you've got very significant, hundreds of square miles of reef habitat succumbing to thermal stress. Well, if you're not depressed already, we usually trot out this particular factoid, and that is that the Ipcc, as Cyril mentioned, Brendan's involved in at the moment, has produced a number of reports, and one of those was on global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And after taking multiple lines of evidence and looking through the evidence very closely, it's very clear that on the pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we still lose 70 to 90% of today's corals by 2100, if not mid-century. And that is really something very hard to take on, because it really means that, and this is going to be very difficult to achieve in itself, even 2 degrees, of course, where you would then have numbers dwindle even further. But when you look at these types of challenges, it really does put into frame rather difficult sort of policy decisions and so on, because you've got essentially a World Heritage site that's disappearing before your eyes. So I'll flick to this picture, just say that not all parts of the reef will be gone, except a large amount will, but focusing in on these areas that may be least exposed to climate change may hold a clue to the type of strategy that we may need to adopt going forward. Anyway, I'll finish there and hand it over to Imogen. Do you want me to unshare?
Yes, your PowerPoint's still on the screen.
Okay. So to find out where the button is for getting out of this. Oh, here it is. Great.
Thank you for that. It was good to show that last image.
I don't have any other data.
Would you cook something up? It is hard to keep a positive attitude when we're working on coral reefs and climate change, but I guess that's what our job is to do. And Ovid's just the best communicator in the world on it. I understand that there are some real pressures by some of the speakers today in my one-to-one discussions. So I'm actually not going to follow on immediately from Ove, because I understand that Scott Heron, who I think is on the call, there he is, also needs to leave fairly quickly. So it's not the most seamless of presentations, but we're going to just bounce around a bit and come back to the reef after Scott has given his presentation. And I'm just going to hand quickly over to Cyril, who's got the notes in front of him, to introduce Scott. Is Cyril there?
Yep, just
I'm sure he's
unmuting.
somewhere. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, Scott Heron is Associate Professor of Physics at James Cook University with a focus on coastal and nearshore environmental physics. His work at JCU continues earlier work with the US government's NOAA Coral Reef Watch program. Scott's current work investigates impacts on coral reefs, including coral bleaching and disease, reef resilience, and conservation management within the context of climate change. With John Day, Scott is co-leading the development and applications of a tool that rapidly assesses climate vulnerability of World Heritage properties. And Scott will tell us about the Climate Vulnerability Index and how it can be used to assess which sites are most at risk of losing their outstanding universal value in the face of a rapidly accelerating climate change crisis. So thank you very much, Scott, and over to you. Oh, and if you have a PowerPoint, you're already up. Okay, great.
Fantastic. Thank you, Cyril, and thank you to all of the organisers, and particularly Imogen, with whom I've been in direct contact. It's been some great discussions so far about the issues that we're meeting, and what I'd like to describe now is, as Cyril mentioned in his introduction, a tool that we've been developing and applying to respond and help properties respond, and we call it the Climate Vulnerability Index. As noted already in Eve's presentation, the Climate Policy Update has recognised that climate change is one of the most significant threats to heritage, both cultural and natural, and these are some statements from other parts of the UNESCO framework there, the advisory bodies and other UN agencies that support that same notion. And we've seen this unveiled in various impacts on coral reefs, glaciers, flooding, storms, fires, intense rainfall events. And if I could hark to Ove's seminal 1999 paper and the projections that were done back in the good old days of a 1996 Ipcc report, if we look at the timing of when those projections would result in extreme and repeated bleaching events, we would see that happening around 2016. Lo and behold, in 2016, we were in the midst of a global coral bleaching event. We were seeing annual bleaching occurring in parts of the world, including the Great Barrier Reef, as Ove illustrated in his talk. These impacts are real, these impacts are present. However, there was no tool that was available to consider the climate vulnerability of World Heritage properties. And this is what John and I took upon as a challenge, a tool that could be consistently applied across all types of World Heritage properties, a tool that had to be systematic, but not too complex. It has to be proactive rather than waiting for irreversible impacts to unveil before understanding them. And it needed to be fit in with the UNESCO World Heritage context and to help inform actions. So we developed the Climate Vulnerability Index, a values-based, science-driven and community-focused effort. So values-based, to touch on this, we use the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value to recognise key values for the property and to summarise these under specific headings. But we also note that there are other significant property values that aren't a part of that World Heritage Standard. And they may be locally important, regionally or domestically important, even internationally important, but not at that highest UNESCO World Heritage Standard. Those are also important values to consider because they are also going to be impacted under climate change. To give you one example from a natural World Heritage property here in Australia, there's a list there of the key values that were identified from the Statement of Outstanding Universal Value, and seagrass was identified for this location as being of particular importance because it was foundational for other values within that statement of OUV. The process is science-driven. We begin with the Ipcc vulnerability approach as used in the 3rd and 4th assessment reports. And you can see that on the screen in front of you. However, we adapt it to focus our vulnerability on the vulnerability of the values for which the property is inscribed. We look at key climate change stresses that are likely to impact those or that are already impacting those. But more than just the property values, we also look into the notion of the community that is impacted and associated with and potentially impacted by a loss of those values due to climate change. Together, these pieces make up the Climate Vulnerability Index. This list on the left-hand side of climate stresses has been derived and compiled from various sources, and it summarizes what we saw were the most likely climate stresses to be influencing World Heritage properties broadly. You'll note down the bottom in the non-coloured section, there's also an area for context-specific stresses to be identified. And so there may be some locations for which a different stressor, not listed in that upper 15 group, would be appropriate to consider. In the top right-hand side, we look at historical climate change data. So climate variables and analyses, derived products from those to examine recent trends, but we also look to the latest projections information as shown in the lower right-hand corner. And one example there for global sea level. The process, values, science, community focused. An analysis of the economic, social and cultural connections that occur with each property. So here the economics consider the business types that are directly associated with the property. The social considers different people groups who use, have visited, sometimes reside within the property. The cultural aspects look at Indigenous and non-Indigenous connections with the property. For each of these, we look at a sensitivity term, this dependency, where we examine the future effect of a loss of World Heritage values due to key climate stresses on each of those components. And we also consider the adaptive capacity, the capacity now for the community to adapt in the face of key climate stresses. And this is one thing that I'd really like to point to. This is a place where, as we've just described in this broader meeting, the notion of perhaps falling into hopelessness. Here we are using this CVI process as a tool to not only look to the adaptive capacities within the values of the property, its natural or cultural features there. We also look to the adaptive capacity to point to opportunities where a community can act to mitigate the impacts of climate change. This is one tangible approach that we must undertake as we continue as a global community to meet the challenge and the needs that we face in terms of the causes of climate change. We need to help these systems along the pathway as well. We use a risk matrix approach within the CVI framework. So through a workshop and a group study approach, we look at assessments of the exposure and sensitivity, which combine together in this risk matrix to give a measure of potential impact. That potential impact gets combined with an assessment of adaptive capacity, and that leads us to a traffic light scale for our OUV vulnerability. That OUV vulnerability becomes the exposure term for the assessment of community vulnerability following the work undertaken by others previously. And we combine that with an assessment of the community dependency to determine the ESC, economic, social, cultural potential impact. Finally, that is combined with the assessed adaptive capacities within each of those economic, social, and cultural groups to arrive at a second traffic light output for community vulnerability. However, again, I point to the notion that within this, we are able to look for knowledge gaps, research opportunities, policy opportunities, and then also places where communities and management structures of the properties can respond to help mitigate the impacts. CVI provides a broad assessment. It considers the key climate stresses and it examines the World Heritage property as a whole, not sliced up into little pieces. It does give opportunity to point to knowledge gaps and areas of further investigation. And we have found that it's a great tool for raising awareness and connecting in through public workshops to communicate the results. But it's also important to note that the CVI isn't a detailed analysis. It's not a deep dive into the vulnerability of all attributes of a property and into all climate stresses. We have to use a high-level, rapid approach. It doesn't delve into the new research areas that are identified, and it doesn't provide all of the solutions, but it does open a door to find ways to do so. To give an example of some output, for the Wadden Sea, 3 key climate stresses selected by the workshop of experts and other stakeholders were temperature trend, extreme temperature events, heat waves, and sea level rise on this coastal community there. You can see the assessments for exposure, for sensitivity, potential impact, adaptive capacity, and the endpoint of this analysis was to arrive at a high degree of vulnerability of the values of the property. When that was taken into account and used as the lens to look through for impacts on the community, the dependency term was identified as being a low negative and therefore a potential impact on the community as being moderate. The adaptive capacity of the community was assessed as being moderate. And as a result, the assessed community vulnerability, the potential impacts on the community due to a loss of World Heritage values was identified as being moderate. To give some examples of our recent applications and the connections to the identified climate stresses, the temperature trend, extreme temperature events, and storm intensity and frequency were identified in our Shark Bay analysis. In the heart of Neolithic Orkney, a cultural property in the far north of Scotland, there was one element of overlap with that prior analysis. In the Wadden Sea, as mentioned, the 2 temperature stressors were identified, as was sea level rise. And our most recent analysis of the city of Edinburgh, an urban World Heritage property, revealed these 3 key climate stresses. At present, we're working on a capacity building and application in Africa, which is funded by UK government. And we're heading quickly towards 2 CVI workshops in Kilwa Kisiwani, Tanzania, and the Suko cultural landscape in Nigeria. Importantly, within this project, we have gone through a training program with 6 selected trainees from a vast array of applicants. The course began on the 25th of May, Africa Day. And this has given us an opportunity to broaden the base of capacity of people in Africa and their understanding of World Heritage and climate change impacts. About every 4 months, 3 times a year, we put out an update newsletter. We're actually up to update number 7, our most recent one. And these are available to provide a little history of things CVI. Finally, I would like to acknowledge not only John Day, my co-developer in all of this work, but various other folks who have provided us with insight and advice along the journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any quick questions for Scott? I know Scott is under some time pressure, so speak now or email him later. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you, Scott. Very clear.
I
And
apologize that I have to take my leave. As you can see, I'm standing in a teaching lab because that's
yes,
that's what we're about to begin. So thanks,
Okay.
folks.
Thank you for taking the time. Cheers.
Thanks, Scott.
An important presentation because it somewhat undermines the claim from governments that there's nothing they can do about climate change, and deserve to be patted on the back for any effort they put forward. In fact, you can take a very clear look at where the vulnerabilities are and where you could actually improve the effectiveness of your management. Imogen, I have to confess, a little bit lost as to the order of things now.
Sure. I think it was
next.
sure. Well, I just wanted to test Brendan's timeline too, because I understand that Brendan is also obviously, from an academic perspective, there's an awful lot of time pressures. I understood that Brendan was also looking at the clock. So Brendan, are you keen to go now, or are you able to wait a bit?
No, I need to talk now too. Yeah.
Okay, all right. I'm going to hand back to Cyril then to introduce Brendan.
Okay, all right. So introducing Professor Brendan Mackey, who is based in Brisbane, Australia at Griffith University, Director of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon, the Griffith Climate Change Response Program, and the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility at Griffith University. He's a coordinating lead author of the Ipcc's Sixth Assessment Report, Working Group 2, focusing on adaptation. Brendan is also a forest ecology who has experience working in all the major forest types around the world, so tropical, temperate, boreal, and brings together expertise on climate change and ecology, and has also worked extensively with Indigenous peoples around the planet and on the Earth Charter. So a very, very broad range of expertise and experience, and addressing an issue that is increasingly of importance and on the radar screen for decision makers all over the planet, which is the issue of fire. And we're seeing news stories from around the world, whether it be from Australia or California or the Mediterranean or the Amazon or boreal forests in Canada and Russia. The incidence of fire is increasing, and that has major implications for ecosystems and World Heritage sites all over the world. So Brendan, please, over to you.
Thanks, Cyril. So I'll just share my screen because I've got a PowerPoint if I can. Yeah.
Yeah,
I can do that.
Yep, there you go.
So let's just see if this works. I'm just trying to turn my PowerPoint on. Now, does that?
Yeah, we can see it fine. That works fine, Brendan.
Yep.
Okay, so okay, I wanted to mainly talk about, you would have heard about, I'm sure you all heard at the time, these mega fires we had in southeastern Australia 2019, and use them to say something about climate change and wildfires and what this might mean for world, in particular natural world heritage sites and their management, their outstanding universal value going forward. This is really my take-home message, so I thought I'd put it up on the first slide. And that is that I think it's critical here to...
Excuse me, Brendan.
Yeah.
We can't see it.
Oh, can't you?
We saw it a minute ago, but now it's gone.
Yep.
Oh, that's interesting.
There you go, it's back.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just see if this works again. Can
Yep.
you see that?
There it is now. Yes.
Okay. So this is my take-home message. So this is the money message, as they say. So To me, the
Lots
important
of money
message,
in World Heritage.
that's right, is that, you know, to appreciate that ecosystems vary in their climate sensitivity and their climate resilience in respect to the climate, a very specific climate related hazard or set of climate related hazards, plus other human influence stresses. And I've got 4 pictures there. The top left one, 3 are of different forest ecosystem types, and one is of a tropical coral reef. And we've heard from Oz how climate sensitive tropical coral reefs are to this hazard. The climate related hazard here is marine heat waves, and the impact marine heat waves has is coral bleaching. And we know that there's a certain threshold where that impact is triggered. These other ecosystem types we're looking at. I think the other thing Oz may not have mentioned was that, and Oz can correct me if I'm wrong, but if a coral reef experiences marine heat wave, that coral reef can regenerate. It can be repopulated. Coral can regrow with its symbiotes, but it takes some time. It takes 9 or 10 years, all going well. So tropical coral reefs are climate sensitive. They're sensitive to heat wave impacts, but they do have a natural resilience. They have a degree of climate resilience. They can bounce back to their former state or something that's like their former biodiverse state. However, what climate change does is increase the frequency and severity and duration of marine heat waves such that their climate resilience is breached. The picture above is of the Great Western Woodlands in southwestern Australia. It's not a World Heritage Site. It should be. The evidence for that has been mounting over the years, something we should be talking about going forward. The flora, the flora of southwestern Australia is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots because it has a very ancient flora, and these systems are very extensive. What we call the Great Western Woodlands is about 11 million hectares. It's a combination of woodland and heath, but a lot of the plants are known from the fossil record. There are species of Banksia extant today whose direct, that exact looking replicates of them are found in the fossil record. So there's a flora there that's been in situ for 30, 40 million years. So it's highly climate insensitive. And if you think about all the enormous climate change that's going on in that region, it's highly climate resilient. If we look to the bottom right corner, that's actually a photograph by Christina Miedemar. I should have put the acknowledgement on there, of in the Amazon, Brazilian Amazon, and a primary tropical rainforest with its structurally intact canopy, closed canopy, it is highly climate insensitive because it maintains this very wet, stable forest interior climate, and it's highly resistant to droughts and extreme weather events and fires, etc. So naturally, tropical wet forests, I would suggest, are not particularly climate sensitive. And how resilient are they? Well, again, if something happens that destroys a stand of tropical forest from some external impact, it can recover. Because what we're seeing with climate change in certain parts of the world, not in all the wet tropics, West Africa is getting wetter, East Africa is getting drier, and rainfall is highly variable. It's not like temperature. Everywhere is getting hotter. With rainfall, it's much more variable. But there are certain parts of the wet tropics where drought is increasing, or there is already a dry, like southeastern Brazil has a dry season. that dry season is getting more severe, what's happening there is you're getting far more human influence stresses. You're getting logging and burning of the perimeter, the boundaries of the primary forest from deforestation, forest degradation, and human fires. So the edges of the rainforest are being fragmented and being dried out and are becoming more fire prone due to human activity. And because those human pressures are constant, their natural resilience is broken. The ecosystem above that is World Heritage. That's part of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. That's part of the tall old growth forest, which is on the eastern perimeter of the boundary. This is the controversial area that that was added, and then we had a prime minister who decided he'd try and get it removed, and an independent World Heritage expert group was sent out to an independent study, and the government accepted their report that it should stay. So it's been a controversial World Heritage part of a World Heritage area. It's actually evolved over 60 million years in the company of wildfire. So all the plants that you see in that picture have evolved and have adaptations that enable them to persist with a particular fire regime, a particular intensity and frequency of wildfires. In this case, the system has evolved so that it's adapted to infrequent but high severity burns. So my point is that when it comes to looking at climate change impacts on natural World Heritage areas, it really has to be assessed in context. We have to understand what kind of ecosystem type we're dealing with, what their natural climate sensitivity and resilience is, and what other human stresses are, if you like, interfering with or getting in the way of their climate sensitivity and resilience. So one of the things the Australian government and the Queensland state government are doing, they have allocated about $1 billion to try and remove other human stresses on the Great Barrier Reef in terms of better managing farming land to reduce sediment and nutrient runoff. The logic being that reducing those human stresses will better allow the natural adaptive capacity of those ecosystems to take effect. As Ove has put out though, as global warming increases, as human influence global warming increases, we reach a level of hazard which breaches the resilience of the system. So at that point, managing the human influence stresses ceases being having any giving any adaptation benefit to the system. So the point I'm trying to make here is that ecosystem natural responses to climate change vary. Some systems will actually be pretty stable. Others will undergo change. That change might be slower than faster, and they will transition to being a different kind of system. There might be different framework species in the canopy. There might be different, it will have different taxonomic composition. It might even be structurally different. Other systems will collapse very quickly, and in time they might ecologically transit to be a different kind of system, or they may not. Might be left with a severely degraded system. So this means that our human adaptation responses to climate change impacts will need to vary from system to system. Some systems, there will be very hard and well-defined limits to adaptation, and there will be very severe loss and damage to OUC, but not all of them. It will be highly variable depending upon the ecosystem type and the natural sensitivity and resilience of the system and the other human stresses that are at play. So if we look in Australia, again, as Ove's pointed out, the Great Barrier Reef is in serious, dire existential trouble. The old growth forests of Tasmania are not. And when you look at projected climate change, if you like, the most benign climate change this century is actually in Tasmania. If you were looking for a place to take refuge from global warming, the South Island of New Zealand and Tasmania would be probably your best bets. That's not to say that there are climate change impacts, but I'm just saying that the impacts, that the kind of climate hazard facing that forest ecosystem and the impacts on that ecosystem are very, very different, you know, by an order of magnitude to those of the Great Barrier Reef. So let me say something about the fires. What I'm talking about comes from a project that I've been doing with Professor David Lindemeyer of the Australian National University in Canberra for the last 18 months. And we've got a website called bushfirefacts.org where we've provided some information about, we've assessed the literature, kind of like a mini, if you like, following the kind of Ipcc methodology. I was inspired by that, where we looked at different questions regarding climate change and bushfires in terms of native forests. So this has a particular focus on Australian natural forests, but a lot of that is relevant globally. And there's a website there where you can access all that information and other interesting things. So as I said, if you take our mind back, we had this extraordinary, unprecedented fire season. It started in September 2009, and the fires burnt continually until the end of February 2020. Actually, that map there shows satellite mapping of all wildfires in Australia during those months. But the ones in the top, or Northern Australia, all that red there, they're normal and natural. It's a monsoonal climate. It has tropical monsoonal climate, has a 7-month dry season, and these are all grass fires. The fires that got all the headlines were the ones here. We call them the Black Summer mega fires. And they burnt, you can see there was 5,700,000 hectares of forest burnt. 5,700,000 hectares burnt in a wildfire that swept down the east coast over about 2,000 kilometres between September and February. About 2.6 million of that was in protected areas, and about 1.6 million of that was in state forest, which is largely logged for commodity production. And on the right, I've got the location of the Gondwana Rainforests of Australia World Heritage Site. That's the red patches here. And you can probably, if we compare those two maps, you can see that the footprint of the fire clearly overlapped with some of those areas. So of the 151,600 hectares of rainforest in the Gondwana Rainforests of Australian Heritage, 16% of it burned. Now, I've stressed rainforest because in Australia we have two basic forest types. We have eucalypt forests, which have evolved very much with fire as a selective agency, and all our eucalypt forests, all the plants in there have life history traits that enable them to either survive a fire or recover rapidly after a fire. But that's not so much the case for the rainforest. The rainforests are in wetter environments, which typically the vegetation is just too wet to burn. So that was unprecedented to have a fire of that magnitude with such a large percentage of rainforest burning. But when we say burnt, fires don't burn with equal severity. So whilst 5.7 million hectares of forest burnt and 16% of that 151,000 hectares of rainforest burnt, the question we have to ask is with what severity, because that determines the ecological impact. So this is a map of the burn, we call it the burn severity within the fire footprint. And a burn severity is a measure, it's remotely sense modeled of what fraction of all the vegetation at a site was incinerated. And it can go from unburned to very low severity where it was a grass fire, if you like, or some of the ground cover was burnt. High severity means everything was scorched from the canopy through the mid layers to the ground. You can see that as you go further south, the fires got more severe, and it's in section B. It's in section B where the Gondwana rainforest was. So the Gondwana rainforest wasn't hit with as severe fires as a lot of the eucalypt forests were further to the south. We've got some numbers for this. And this is not just within the World Heritage Area. This is all the rainforest, what we call rainforest and vine thicket within the area that was affected by fire. There was 163,000, there was 800,000 hectares of rainforest that was not burned. There was 163,000 that was burned. But most of that, 112,000 hectares was at low to moderate, and there was only 13,000 that was at high. So in terms of resilience of this rainforest ecosystem, the concern is for this 23,000 and 13,000 moderate to high, because it's possible that the trees were killed. And we don't actually know what will happen to those rainforest trees if they were killed. So let me say something quickly about the causes of these fires. And this is where the human influenced climate change comes in. And this is an extraordinary shot from actually the Blue Mountains back in Sydney of the wildfire in action. They were driven, or they were set up, if you like, although they were, well, first of all, they were unprecedented in terms of their geographic location, spatial extent, severity, and the forest fire burn. They were set up and driven by extreme weather conditions, and there were two factors. One is a really deep winter drought. So remember, our spring starts in September. That's our first months of our spring. The preceding months is our winter, and in southern Australia and East Australia, that's the wet season. And this is a clear climate change signal where over the last 100 years, there's been a 20 to 30% decline in winter rainfall in southern Australia. And that winter was the driest winter on record. And what that meant was at the end of winter, all the forest vegetation and woodland vegetation, living and dead, was tinder dry. It was at the lowest measured moisture content that had ever been recorded over such an extensive area of forest. And then we had this extraordinary heat wave conditions, extreme heat wave events right in the first month of spring. So it's like summer had been dragged forward 4 months from January through to September with extreme heat wave events at the end of the deepest drought on record with tinder dry vegetation. And then you get high winds, and then you get ignition, and those conditions persisted for 5 months. So the drought in winter and the high spring are clearly attributable to human influenced climate change. So what this means is and I think I've got another graph that shows this. This map shows the change in dangerous fire weather days in Australia since the 1950s. So what we're seeing is an increase in what we call dangerous fire weather conditions: drought, declining winter rainfall, increasing high temperatures in spring and summer. So the fire season is getting longer. The fire weather conditions are getting more severe, and we're going to be getting these kind of conditions more frequently. And this scenario is playing out elsewhere in the world, particularly in the temperate and boreal zones. So this is very similar story to what's happening in Western USA and Western Canada, and also actually right across the boreal, particular in Siberia boreal. Very similar climate change driven factors that are increasing the dangerous fire weather conditions. What does this mean in terms of forest management? I guess very quickly, it means that fire weather is well, let me come to this. Before we read all that text, again, the key message is this. Up until now, everyone has thought the way you manage wildfires is by reducing the amount of fuel that's in a landscape. So in a forest, management agencies talk about hazard reduction burning. They go in and they burn off a lot of the litter and ground cover layer. Of course, they argue that reducing the amount of fuel will mean you're less likely to have a bad fire. Climate change means that's not the case. The critical factor is not the amount of fuel, but how dry the fuel is, because that is what is a drier fuel is more combustible, it's more flammable. So what this means is we really have to completely rethink how we manage our forested landscapes. We're fooling ourselves if we think that going in and burning the forest to get rid of litter is going to reduce the risk of fire if, under these extreme fire weather conditions. We're getting more extreme fire weather conditions. The more extreme fire weather conditions get, the less helpful it is to do fuel reduction burning. This means we need to be thinking about, managing our forests as an asset to be protected rather than a risk to be managed, right? So currently, forests are seen as a source of fuel, which is a threat. So we should be preventing, and this is really, really relevant, I think, for managing our forested World Heritage areas. We need to be preventing human ignitions. There's no fire without ignition. We need to be extinguishing wildfires rather than letting them run their course when we have severe fire weather conditions. Once you have severe fire weather conditions, as we saw 2 years ago, they just become uncontrollable. We need to reduce the exposure of built assets through spatial planning, including managed retreat. We should cease broad-scale hazard reduction burning with annual area targets, because this is now useless fire mitigation strategy. We will need to be targeting suppression efforts to protect sensitive refugia habitats and ecosystems. We saw that 2 years ago. The New South Wales Environment Minister sent in a fire SWAT squad with helicopters carrying water to protect the last remaining wild population of Wallamai pine in the Blue Mountains. And there's all sorts of things that we do to forests, post-logging, burning, thinning and everything, which is actually making the forest drier. And if a forest is drier, it's more flammable, and under extreme weather conditions, it's going to burn more. So we need to be facilitating the natural regenerative and adaptive capacity of our systems where possible. And as everyone has been noting, the most important action is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Because again, it's entirely analogous with what Ove was saying about marine heat waves. The more global warming increases above 1.5 degrees, then the more frequent and severe wildfires are going to become. It's entirely analogous to the marine heat wave effect. So again, if we allow global warming to get above 2 degrees, particularly in winter rainfall zones in Mediterranean, and we're seeing this already in the Mediterranean world, the big wildfires in Greece and Turkey, etc. Anywhere that's got a winter rainfall zone, we're seeing a decrease in winter rainfall, hotter springs, and really, really accelerated dangerous fire weather. Okay, I'll stop there, Cyril. Sorry if I've gone on too long. You should have stopped me.
No, we love the enthusiasm.
Okay.
Thank you. That was very useful and very important. And yes, this is a problem that we're going to start to see everywhere. And it's important to keep in mind the range of threats that we're going to start to experience. And water and fire is next on the global agenda. We've seen species extinctions, pandemic, coral reef die-off, and habitat shifts, glacial melt, and this is all sort of aiming towards a water and a fire crisis, which will be, critically important problems. So it's very depressing, and it's important to understand these dynamics because they're going to be affecting everybody. And so I think this bushfire project is fundamentally important, and it's cutting edge research, and it's going to be relevant. The next step is to start comparing these fire conclusions to dynamics in other forest types, and that would make a very useful project. Imogen, thank you, Brendan. Are we moving on to Sajed now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so we continue to jump around in a way that's governed by time zones and complicated schedules, not by a clear rationale for our program. So don't try to follow this in a logical way, because it isn't logical. But the information is all great, and who knows, maybe we can rearrange it after we've recorded all this. But thank you for your patience, Sajed. I'll introduce Dr. Sajed Kamal, who is based in the US, is a renewable energy and sustainable development educator, and has been internationally for over 40 years, setting up projects in the US, but also Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Armenia, El Salvador, and Zimbabwe, so all over the world. Dr. Kamal taught in the Sustainable International Development Program at Brandeis University for 20 years and served as a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists Speakers Bureau for 10 years. He's received numerous awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award by the US Environmental Protection Agency, is the author of The Renewable Revolution, How We Can Fight Climate Change, Prevent Energy Wars, Revitalize the Economy, and Transition to a Sustainable Future, as well as Sundarban poems and photographs of an enchanting journey. Dr. Kamal has been asked by the National Committee for Saving the Sundarbans of Bangladesh to present a Sundarbans case study today. So thank you very much, Sajed, over to you. And I think you're still on mute.
Thank you, Cyril, and thank you, Imogen, because you have been behind the scene connecting me to this symposium. Thanks to the earlier presenters. They're very compelling, and there's much to think about, and as well as tools to act on. So act on and act with. So I deeply appreciate it. I would also like to thank Earth Justice and the whole organization, as well as Jessica and Eve. They have been true partners in this effort to save the Sundarbans. I think that to me it's a global issue, but at the same time, it can be a global issue, but not necessarily there's a global collaboration. So I think that our justice's role in this has been tremendously and critically important. So I deeply appreciate that. And I also want to thank BAPA, really. Again, I'm intimately connected and committed to BAPA mission. At the same time, when I go to Bangladesh every year, every other year, I participate in BAPA events directly. I remain connected with it, but truly, the people who are there, they are doing the footwork, they are taking the risk, they are speaking up on this issue every day. So to me, I take this opportunity to speak on behalf of BAPA with great honor and responsibility. So thank you. And also thanks to the people who are present, really. So, okay. With this preface, I go to, as I was told, I've been told, Cyril mentioned that I'm here to present the following position statement of the National Committee for Saving the Sundarbans, or NCSS. It is a coalition of over 50 environmental and human rights organizations coordinated by Bangladesh Poribesh Andolan, or BAPA, the largest and oldest environmental network in Bangladesh. Now, the absence of slides, I will give some description of the Sundarban. Only picture I can show is from my books. If you can see this, this is just a very quick look at the picture of Sundarban, and truly, it's truly is a magical place. It's a mysterious, magical place, but at the same time, it's thriving with life and thriving with a lot of activities. So it's a very real place that has a very significant place in Bangladesh's existence and future. So I will describe Sundarban briefly for those who may not be familiar with. So the Sundarbans World Heritage Site of Bangladesh covers part of the world's largest mangrove ecosystem shared between Bangladesh and India, where the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna rivers meet the Bay of Bengal. It is the only remaining habitat in the lower Bengal basin for a huge variety of wildlife, including endangered Bengal tigers, Ganges river dolphins, and Irrawaddy dolphins. The mangroves are the nursery for fisheries that feed tens of millions of people. Over 3 million people rely directly on Sundarban for livelihoods. The mangrove reduce the speed of deadly cyclones that hit our coastline every year. Vast amounts of carbon are stored in its biodiversity. The Sundarban is also terribly vulnerable to climate change. Scientists call it an extreme climate hotspot due to the devastating floods that are worsening with stronger cyclones and higher tides. Climate change worsens river flooding due to rising sea level, Himalayan glacier melt, and torrential rains. Under the World Heritage Convention, Bangladesh must do its utmost to protect the Sundarbans from all threats, including climate change. That means reducing and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions as we develop our economy. But the government says it won't transition to zero carbon economy unless international financiers make it happen. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel interests of India, China, Australia, and others call the shots. Bangladesh becomes a dumping ground for coal, the world's dirtiest fuel. 3 gigawatts of coal power plants are under construction at Rampal, Paira, and Taltoli, surrounding the Sundarbans. Thousands of people in Bangladesh, India, and around the world have protested these coal plants. Peaceful marchers have been met with police beatings and tear gas. People have been jailed and threatened. Over 1 million people signed a petition calling on India not to finance the coal plant at Rampal. Since 2015, over 50,000 people and dozens of organizations have called on the World Heritage Committee to urge Bangladesh to cancel the coal plant and stop all heavily pollutant industries and associated shipping and dredging in the Sundarbans. In 2016, the IUCN and World Heritage Center called for the plant at Rampal to be canceled or relocated due to the risk of air and water pollution. In 2017 and 2019, the committee called for all large-scale industries or infrastructure in southwestern Bangladesh to not proceed until a strategic environmental assessment for the region is complete. But the government moved ahead with coal plants, new industries, shipping and dredging. It falsely claimed it was fully compliant with the committee's recommendations. Since 2017, NCSS has been presenting evidence from satellite imagery, independent scientists, and public records on the ongoing construction of coal plants, dredging, and new heavy industries near Mangla Port. Since 2017, the Paira coal plant has been operational with unknown impacts to river dolphin and hillsa fisheries. Dredging and shipping are increasing in the Poshu River. Barges of Indian coal are now being shipped through the Sundarbans to Rampal coal plant. It will begin operating in a few months. The coal plant till Taltoli, just 12 kilometers from the World Heritage Site, is under construction, even without a publicly available EIA or environmental permit. A government agency, the National River Conservation Commission, even gave a written order to stop this plant, as it is illegally set up on riverbank. Toxic coal ash will be dumped on floodplains and will wash into the Sundarbans and Bay of Bengal with the next cyclone. The coal plants lack vital air pollution control technologies. Fabric filters are needed to reduce primary particulate pollution. Selective catalytic reduction needs to reduce the NOx that cause smog. Activated carbon injection systems are needed to capture mercury emission. Carbon capture systems are needed to capture greenhouse gases. The G7 and other global initiatives are urging an end to unabated coal plants around the world, but these technologies are not being used in Bangladesh. The 2021 decision of the World Heritage Committee was much weaker than previous years. It called for no further additional shipping, dredging, or industries that might harm the OUV of the property. It failed to criticize the hundreds of permitted industries threatening the Sundarbans with pollution and greenhouse gases. NCSS calls upon the World Heritage Committee to uphold the mission of the World Heritage Convention, which is to take decision from conservation of World Heritage sites on the basis of scientific evidence. The 2021 decision also asked for the strategic environmental assessment to be completed this month. This is frustrating, as we have been warning since early 2020 that strategic environmental assessment fails to meet basic standards of scientific integrity, transparency, or adequate public participation. So, regarding the strategic environment assessment, the NCSS demands that 1, the C must include all the public consultation measures that were promised in the initial prospectus when it becomes safe to do so. 2, the C must include modeling of the cumulative impacts of air and water pollution from all existing and proposed industries in Southwest Bangladesh, including coal plants at Paira and Taltoli. Modeled pollutants must include heavy metal, including mercury, selenium, arsenic, and radioactive matter from smokestacks and ash dumps. 3, all data must be made public, including all parameters of the models. 4, complete EIAs must be made available for the plants in Taltoli and Kalapara and all industries in Mangla. 5, a draft of the C must be made public in all stakeholders' languages, adequate time given for public review and comments. 6, finally, the C must respond in detail to all public comments and experts' peer reviews. NCSS continues to urge IUCN and UNESCO to provide Article 6.3 of the World Heritage Convention, which requires signatories to the convention to protect all World Heritage sites beyond their jurisdiction. We urge World Heritage bodies to call out the state parties, including China and India, that are financing devastating projects around the Sundarbans. We also once again call for the Sundarbans to be added to the list of World Heritage in danger, as the IUCN has recommended in 2019. This will galvanize international support for clean energy and truly sustainable development around the Sundarbans. We fully recognize the need for affordable energy for sustainable development and note that several research reports of international stature has confirmed that Bangladesh is richly endowed with the renewable energy resources to meet those needs. NCSS also hopes that IUCN shall urgently conduct the independent technical review to determine if the strategic environment assessment has met the standards of the IUCN World Heritage Advice Note on environmental assessment, which requires public participation at all stages, and the World Heritage Operational Guide 118bis, which requires assessments to identify development alternatives and recommend mitigation measures against negative impacts on World Heritage sites and their wider settings. Climate change and ecological degradation of Sundarbans by coal plants and other heavy industries are creating a vicious cycle for Bangladesh that must not be allowed to take hold. We ask the international community to stand with us. Thank you for your attention, and let's work together onward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sajid. It is indeed, I think, the final lines there are critical, that this is a vicious cycle, a downward spiral, where you burn coal, degrade a natural environment, which is one of the most effective and efficient at storing carbon, avoid investing in renewable energies, which is where the focus should be, and in all of that, also harm local communities. It's a lose proposition.
Yep.
And if we can't do better than that, and if the international community can't support better than that, then we're all in trouble.
Thanks.
Yeah. Imogen, I'm conscious that we're starting to run a little bit late. We're heading towards 2 hours, but did you want to add to Ove's presentation for the record and the recording, or are you happy to leave it there, or it's really your call?
Sure. Well, thanks, Cyril, and thanks, Sajid, too. I think it was a very powerful presentation. I've written some notes which probably would take me an hour to get through. So I might just take 5 minutes, just being acutely aware of the time. There's just so much to say about the Great Barrier Reef, not in terms of what's actually happened to it in recent years, because that was discussed extremely well by Ove, of course. But what I was going to talk about was what happened this year, because I think it was immensely significant. And really, in some ways, it was a tale of two cities. You had, on the one hand, UNESCO and IUCN, who really took a very strong stand on climate change. I would say it was globally significant. I think it's the first time in the history of the World Heritage Convention, 49 years, that the advisory bodies have taken such a strong stand, not just on climate resilience measures, but importantly on climate mitigation. And so it was, in some ways, crossing the Rubicon, really, entering this field of climate mitigation, specifically in relation to one site and specifically in relation to one state party. And so I just don't think that can be underestimated in terms of the importance of what happened. The other tale of the other city was what the World Heritage Committee actually decided. And unfortunately, it was a very poor and egregious process and decision. The advisory bodies, the draft decision that was put up, recommended that the Great Barrier Reef be added to the World Heritage and Danger List, that it actually had ascertained in danger, not just potential in danger, and immediate action needed to be taken and corrective measures needed to be developed, including formulation of the state of conservation for the removal of the property from the list. And this related to climate change. It wasn't only climate change, it was also particularly water quality issues to deal with agricultural runoff, and the fact that government hadn't met the targets that were set. But primarily it was due to the impacts of the 3 bleaching events that Ove talked about, and the cumulative impact over time of bleaching impacts earlier and other local threats. The Australian government's response was to go on the attack. So just as Alec Ma presented yesterday, he talked about the Australian government's response to Kakadu and the proposed uranium mine in the 1990s. The Australian government has form in this regard, and so it went on the immediate attack. It claimed privately, it initiated an immediate high-level phone call with Audrey Azoulay, the Director General of UNESCO, to start the complaints, and then it initiated a public campaign, and that public campaign started by blaming China as the chair of the committee. So it set the public narrative that it was really because of China's hostility to Australia. and it went on from there. I won't go into all the details. They're a bit murky and unfortunate. But Australia unleashed a very significant, intense diplomatic lobbying effort, including the minister flying on an Air Force jet to Europe to meet with officials, diplomats, other politicians face-to-face in various cities in Europe, and going to Paris. There was a huge media battle over this in Australia and globally. The response from UNESCO was very, very important. Rather than backtracking under fire from Australia, UNESCO went on the front foot and launched a public defense of its draft decision. The spokesperson was Dr. Fanny Duvert. She was on national television here, national radio. She said that this draft decision was based on science. There was no politics involved. There was plenty of science to back this decision up. There were, she pointed to the Ipcc 1.5 special report on 1.5 degrees. She referred to the Great Barrier Reef Outlook report. And of course, there was the IUCN Outlook report as well, which found that climate change had become the biggest threat to World Heritage sites, natural World Heritage sites. So UNESCO's argument was very, very clear. This is about science, and this is a wake-up call to the international communities. It wasn't about singling out Australia, although Australia had responsibilities, but it was a call to the international community. Now is the time. It was the time not to fight this decision, but to unite to save the Great Barrier Reef. The civil society response was also very intense. We mounted a huge campaign. We used media extensively. We used I don't want to say we use scientists, but we obviously spoke to many, many scientists. They in turn decided to write their own letters to speak out publicly. They wrote to UNESCO in strong support. They went to the media. We had leading figures in Australia across business, the arts, entertainment, and former politicians. We mobilized people internationally. We had former presidents speaking out. We had the Prince Albert of Monaco signed a global statement. Actors, film stars. There was tremendous pressure, and yet, because we were unable to leave the country because of COVID, because the Australian government had mobilized all its diplomatic missions around the world to use all their efforts to speak to relevant capitals. We were outgunned, essentially. And so the Australian government was able to get a majority of support on the committee to back their view that they were being unfairly singled out. And that it was a matter of procedural unfairness that Australia was being pinpointed over climate change. And so working with its friends in the Middle East, particularly Bahrain, that initiated the amendment. There was an amendment that was joined onto by a range of other committee members. In fact, there were 12 out of the 21 members who signed a submission for us, who submitted an amendment on behalf of Australia. Weakening the decision and removing the endanger aspect, which of course then removed the corrective measures responsibility to deal with climate change. Unfortunately, because so many had signed on to the amendment, it left the tactics on the floor of the committee amongst a small number of countries that actually did believe Australia should do more on climate change. It left them really with very few tactics to use. And so the decision that was passed did remove all reference to any endanger listing and the corrective measures, as I said. So I don't want to overestimate how poor the final decision was, because it still does require Australia to urgently do more on climate change. The State of Conservation report did refer to 1.5 degrees as a critical threshold for the future of the Great Barrier Reef. And so it's now up to civil society in Australia to continue the linkage between the Great Barrier Reef, which is loved by every Australian, and coming up with a national policy and plan that's compatible with a 1.5 degree pathway. At the moment, you couldn't be more different in those two things in Australia. We have to integrate and merge those two pathways. Fortunately, Norway and China managed to amend the amendment, and now Australia has to report back next year instead of 2 years' time. So the pressure is now on Australia to lift its game, and it's quite possible that next year the advisory bodies may again recommend that the Great Barrier Reef goes on the endanger list. That's certainly not impossible, but it actually raises a huge debate. Can the World Heritage Convention deal with climate mitigation? And I think Earth Justice has over years demonstrated in its reports and in its advocacy that it can. And this is the first time that UNESCO and the IUCN have actually taken a stand and said, yes, we can, and we're going to apply that to the Great Barrier Reef because it's so obvious that coral reefs are at stake and the Great Barrier Reef has been so badly hit in the last few years. There's much more that could be said about this, but I've tried to keep my comments to the absolute barest minimum. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. I much appreciated, and I think it was important to get that on the record and included in the recording for this session. So it's an ongoing story. As we mentioned, next year it'll be a decade of discussion on this very topic.
Cyril, could I just say one more thing? I should have said that at the beginning. I really want to thank the NGO that supported me through all this, which was the Australian Marine Conservation Society, which I represent in the advocacy to the World Heritage Committee.
Absolutely. So thank you for that. It's an ongoing saga, and more next year, unfortunately. I will not give a complete PowerPoint because it's late and we've been talking for almost 2 hours now, but I will run through this extremely quickly just to make the point that we have revisited several times over the last few days, which is that yes, sites, including the Sundarbans, including the Great Barrier Reef, including forests all over the world, including glacial sites, are under serious threat from climate change. And at the same time, World Heritage Sites can be a fundamental part of the natural response to climate change. And that these sites both store vast amounts of carbon that needs to be protected, and that if even a fraction of the carbon in ecosystems around the world is released, it can easily take us into catastrophic climate change, regardless of what we do in terms of fossil fuels. And also that these sites have the capacity to continue to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's a two-way story. Climate change is both a threat, and World Heritage Sites are also part of the response. And as we discussed, and as Brendan discussed on day one, the importance of very large areas of natural areas, wild areas, land or sea, is that they have the capacity to store much more carbon than a disturbed or degraded area, to store it more safely over a longer period of time. And they also have the capacity to continue to draw down carbon dioxide. So the areas with ecosystem integrity, which is exactly what the convention is intended to help protect, are vitally important for climate, And they're also vitally important for a range of other values, from water quality to erosion control to biodiversity protection, but also for cultural reasons. It's fascinating, and I won't dwell on all this now because we're running out of time, but the most biodiverse areas on the planet are also often the most culturally, linguistically diverse areas on the planet. So there is an overlap between biodiversity, ecosystem services, cultural and linguistic diversity, and it's a very important point that when you have a wild landscape, a large wild landscape, what you are doing is in fact maximizing a whole range of vitally important values that really help to make this planet habitable. So we know climate's getting worse. We know the biodiversity crisis is getting worse. We know that indigenous governance around the world is essential to protecting nature, including at very large scales. This is the Kaiapó territory in southeastern Brazil, which is the size of Portugal. And we've made some progress in the convention in terms of integrating cultural and natural values, including some wonderful sites in 2018 at Chiribiquete in Colombia, which protected uncontacted tribes, and some of the most spectacular rock art on the planet. Central Sihote Alin extension in Siberia, which was an important tiger habitat, but also helped recognize community rights and access to the park. And then, of course, Pimachuanaki in Canada, which was the first nomination really put forward by Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples in Canada. And so I think a landmark, very important nomination going forward. But we also know that the large wild places around the planet are getting degraded very quickly. And I won't go through all these slides. I think it's well established at this point that the planet is degrading, fragmenting and getting cleared at very high rates. We're building 25 million kilometers of new roads by 2050 is an astonishing statistic. The point I would like to make is that the convention is an important, very important tool in responding to land degradation and to climate change, because it's uniquely positioned to protect very large areas. And we've seen that throughout the world over the years, that some of the biggest protected areas on the planet are also World Heritage Sites, both on the marine and on the terrestrial side. Tens of millions of hectares on the marine side, including the French Antarctic territories that was recently nominated, which was, I think, 70 million hectares. So we're talking about a very large scale conservation mechanism, so much so that even though there are only 257 natural sites around the world, that amounts to 370 million hectares, which is about 8% of the protected areas around the planet. So a very high percentage of protected areas extent is in World Heritage Sites, and these are some of the most iconic and important places left on the planet. I think I won't go through all this detail, but the potential for inscribing very large areas is still there. And we've seen that in Colombia, we've seen that in Canada, we've seen that in the marine side in France. This is still a mechanism that could be used to both protect very, very large areas and do it in a way that is specifically led by communities and indigenous peoples, and done at their initiative, if those people are supported and compensated appropriately. So I think to get to the point of that Scott and others made, that this is not a hopeless situation. There is much we could do, and we could provide a very progressive, very visionary approach where Indigenous peoples and communities lead the way in protecting large areas, both for their natural and cultural values, and create a mechanism that is fundamentally important in mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. And instead of subsidizing coal plants, and instead of subsidizing logging, and instead of subsidizing extractive approaches, if we in fact subsidized Indigenous peoples and communities, or rather compensated them appropriately for the services and benefits that they are providing the entire planet, we could be really turning these lose-lose situations into something much more hopeful and much more exciting. And so we've done quite a bit of research on what this looks like, but just to point out that there are very large areas where World Heritage sites are being managed at very large, at continental scales, in an integrated manner, and there is potential for doing this more. We did have a workshop in the Himalayas to address the potential in that region, and there's a very inspiring example coming out of Africa right now, where Botswana is looking at extending the Okavango Delta from northern Botswana across Namibia and into the forests and the headwaters up in Angola. So there are very, very large scale visionary approaches that could be addressing climate change, cultural values, biodiversity, all together. And the challenge is how to get to that hopeful, progressive approach as fast as possible, despite some very, very discouraging results this year. So I think with that, it's late. I wanted to add the protected areas pragmatic approach to Eve's policy analysis earlier today. We need both. We need to be pressuring in the General Assembly and advocating for better climate policies, and we need to be putting forward some practical visions for what this could look like that provide a new approach to renewable energy and cultural and natural heritage protection, and biodiversity protection, and climate mitigation. We can do all those things, but it will require a conscious effort to restore the convention to what it should be, and to flip the subsidies from extraction to community and Indigenous support. So I think we'll conclude on that note with many thanks to everybody, and looking forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you very much, Cyril. I am overawed by your capacity to pull us all together on top of your existing heavy workload, and I just really wanted to thank you for your contributions in pulling this all together this week. It's been really marvelous, and I will be there on Monday to see the next round of our World Heritage, which I think is on nature culture linkages. Is that right?
Yes, those will all be recorded presentations. And we're still actually compiling them, so they may be a day or two late, but we will do it. They are coming, and that will be the final missing link in all these discussions. So it's still more to come.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all for staying late. Much appreciated.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.